patient attention, not outrage.
Continuity, just enough to feel like anesthesia. Let the hours shepherd you, not hurry you.
It doesn't want to be flat.
Some maps remember what we agree to forget.
No drama, only competence.
As it was, so you can rest as you are.
Silence wasn't sacred. It was enforced. Tonight, it's gentle.
For the next 2 hours, you have a story and the calm to fall asleep.
I was ordained to keep silence, and for a while I mistook silence for virtue. They taught us to fold our words like vestments, to press them flat until even the creases were devotional. I learned the choreography of quiet, how to accept a key without asking what door it served, how to nod at a seal as though wax itself were sacrament, how to shape a smile that said, "I know enough," and a posture that said, "I will never know more." It is a strange thing to serve a library built to outlast questions. Stranger still, to realize that the quiet was not holy. It was enforced. On the night I found the door, I was not seeking miracles. Monastic life distills miracles into errands. A candle replaced, a ledger balanced, a passage copied in a hand steady enough to persuade a skeptical century. I was in the catacomb annex that those of us in the quiet wing called the ribs rooms, spaced like breathing, corridors ribbed with shelves that bowed under the weight of vellum and iron and time. The air was the temperature of bone. Dust lifted when you walked and settled only on permission. Some said the dust here had memorized so many steps that it knew who would live and who would leave. I carried a lantern lower than the archives required, so the light would not glance off metal and betray me to the watchposts. I was not supposed to be in this corridor. But rules are a kind of map, and all maps invite the eye to the unmapped. All borders whisper of an elsewhere. I had been told that the catacombs ended at a wall of limestone smoothed so patiently it looked like perpetuity. I had fetched books from every drawer that abutted that wall. I had counted the rivets in the chain that bound a seditious atlas to a lectern, watched the rings wear grooves, as if the book had paced in its pen for centuries. I knew this place like the roof of my mouth. I knew it until I didn't. It was the lantern's wick that betrayed the seam. I trimmed it crooked, and the flame leaned, a caterpillar of light crawling sideways until it licked an angle wrong for any honest stone. The wall shimmered not with moisture but with intention. A line thin as a paper cut traced an arch where no mason had ever been paid to carve one. The dust there did not cling. It slid away, as if the wall had been exhaling all these years, and I had finally stood in time with its breath. I pressed my thumb to the line because I am human, and we touch what we fear in hope it will become knowable. The limestone was cool and ordinary, the way the sea is ordinary until you cannot feel the bottom with your feet. I raised the lantern and the seam brightened. Something gleamed. A cross stitched through with 7 stars. No, not stitched, engraved with a filigree, so fine it looked like thread tugged through stone by a patient needle. The longer I looked, the more the stars seemed to move, like minnows turning in a culvert. I told myself it was the oil's ripple in the lantern, that cheap slosh of light. I knew better. I know better now. There is a catalog number for everything in the quiet wing. We number the drawers where relics sleep, the oaken pegs where chasubles hang, the boxes where plain clothes are folded for those who must traverse the city without drawing zealous eyes. We number the saints stripped from calendars too, the vacated. I once saw a list of their names scratched into lead, each name crossed with a blade that bit both metal and the hand that carved it. The ledger below it read, "Substitutions recorded. Observe feast day transpositions." And then a note in a hurried, sharp script. "Remember the substituted do not die, they go elsewhere." I had not understood that line. The seam understood me first. I could have reported the mark to the archivist on duty, the same way I once reported a beetle chewing a salter's spine. I did not. I dimmed the lantern. Breath held against the fear that there are notes in the dark only the lungs can hear. I traced the stars. Cold rose into my thumb, no, not cold exactly, but the sensation of stepping into air that belonged to another altitude. The scene deepened as if admitting its own existence, as if it had been waiting for a fingertip willing to feel guilt afterward. A click, like a latch humoring itself, reached me through the stone. When a door opens in a place where there are no doors, your first duty is to decide whether you will name it a door. Words are cages with courtesy titles. We honor them for letting us pretend to tame what we fear. I could tell myself that some ancient mason had left a maintenance passage, as if time might be oiled or grief greased. I could tell myself that a misplaced sarcophagus required a gap, that a misaligned pipe allowed a crack. But the symbol of the cross, veined with stars, said otherwise. This was not for maintenance. This was for memory. The weight of silence is measured in breaths abandoned. I abandoned 3, maybe 4, before I slipped my lantern's hook into the notch that had once been seam and tugged. The limestone gave the minor resistance of a cathedral door at dawn stiff, because night had convinced it to be heavy, yielding because light is stubborn. The slab pivoted inward on hinges so patient they did not squeal. The smell that came out was old brass and rain-soaked vellum, and something else, metallic, like dried blood rubbed into parchment with regretful fingers. It is a smell you will never forget once you let it into you. The ghost of iron that ink leaves when it believes itself to be scripture. Beyond the seam, a stairwell spiraled like a question that cannot be phrased. Steps narrow as penitents dropped into a cylinder of shadow, and on the inner wall, shallow niches waited where hands could land without the arrogance of a rail. I lifted the lantern, and the flame shrank, as if warned. Light, like the obedient, learns its limits young. I set my foot on the first step because I had already set my thumb on the door, and the body keeps its own vows, whether the mouth will admit them or not. Descent rearranges sound. The world above shuts its lid, and the heartbeat that was safely yours expands until it becomes a geography. A point, a line, a plane, drips acquired voices. When they fell into stillness, they reported distances, measures, perhaps even dates. If I had known how to listen, the stair bent me into itself, turning. If I had looked back, I would have seen no more than the lantern's orphaned glow kissing limestone and calling it family. I did not look back. The first rule of the quiet wing is never to count how many doors are between you and weather. The second rule is to always count how many words you will need to excuse where you have been. I had none ready. That should have stopped me. It didn't. Halfway down, if there is a halfway in a spiral, you learn the size of your own fear by the size of your steps. Mine shortened. I held the lantern low between shin and stone because I trusted gravity more than providence. My breath laced itself with the old brass smell, until it tasted like coins licked in childhood, that dare we give our tongues when we want proof of the metal we have been told is precious. The wall brushed my shoulder, and in the brush I felt character, a shallow groove, the shape of a mark repeated at intervals, engraved prayers. Maintenance tallies? No. The symbol, the cross, and the 7 stars, small this time, stamped in a cadence down the shaft like beads on a rosary. It was not repetition. It was insistence. The steps thickened with damp. My habit's hem whispered against stone and picked up grit, and within that grit I felt the lightest shadow of a current. There was water below, not a flood, not even a stream. The kind of water that stays in one place until a purpose is brought to it. When the stair ended, it ended without ceremony. One more step might have been stone, and the step after that was not. The lantern showed me a floor inscribed with lines so fine my eye had to refuse its own certainty to see them. 7 radiating from a center I could not yet find, like a compass invented by a geometry that preferred the dark. I raised the lantern, and the ceiling leaned away from the light, like a cat too dignified to flee. Smoke had darkened it in coiling signatures, the calligraphy of centuries of candles exhaling the breath we demanded of them. The chamber was circular. The air trembled faintly, as if it had not been disturbed in a long time, as if it had opinions it had not voiced. On the far side, an opening lowered like a lip. The sound grew stronger there, water not running but ringing. There is a note only water makes in stone, when it has no distance to travel, and all the distance in the world to remember. I approached the sound, because sound approaches you if you do not. The floor's inscribed lines met a circle before the opening, and within that circle the stone had been polished to the patience of a mirror. The lantern halations swam on it, doubled and rearranged by scratches too deliberate to be damage. When I knelt knees, protesting a confession they had not been promised, I saw the scratches were letters, and the letters were almost Latin, almost Greek, almost a music I had heard only in the voices of the oldest custodians when they forgot their throats were watched. Still, the water called. I slid through the opening, and the breath of the chamber changed, temperature dropping not by degrees but by memory. It smelled like extinguished wicks, like linen folded around an argument, like the first page of a book you are not allowed to finish. The well waited in the middle of a smaller room whose walls had been disciplined to hold their curve. Its rim was metal-lined, not iron and not brass, something silvered, a sheen that dulled and flashed according to a rhythm ungoverned by my lantern. The surface was black as an onyx pupil, light refusing to sit on it as if the water considered light a rumor. I set the lantern down, and my hand shook, not from fear alone but from recognition. I had read of a thing like this in a ledger that pretended to speak of plumbing, fons argentius, the silver well. The notation beside it had been modest to the point of insult maintenance, impossible without prior authorization, ritual residue persistent. A stain, then, a problem. We are trained to tidy problems. We are not trained to admit when the stain is the point. Do not mistake this for courage. I reached because to not reach would have been to acknowledge a limit, and the quiet wing trains a different vanity. We will look into anything if it promises to look back the way we prefer. My fingers hovered over the surface and stopped just above it, where cold rose and sat under my nails like the thought of winter. The black did not reflect my face. It reflected nothing. To be reflected is to be seen. To be seen is to be recorded. To be recorded is to be preserved. To be preserved is to be controlled. The well's refusal felt like freedom, spoken in a grammar I did not yet understand. Behind me, the ink-scratch letters on the floor seemed to crisp. I turned my head and saw no, felt their arrangement shift from ornament to instruction. The cross and the 7 stars waited in the center of the circle with a patience I recognized now, custodial, not paternal. There is a difference between a thing that tends and a thing that rules. The well tended to something, the way a keeper tends to a creature, clever enough to feign sleep, old enough to feign death, faithful enough to let you believe you are the one maintaining it. If you ever want to know what kind of man you are, count the questions you ask aloud when no one is there to hear you. I asked none. Words would have named the fear and fixed it where it could not evolve into understanding. I let my hand fall the last inch. My fingertips broke the surface, and sound became touch. A note I felt in my teeth, a pressure along my jaw, a vibration in the bones of my face, like a tuning fork wetted and pressed to the sinuses. The water was colder than truth, and like truth, it did not relent. I kept my fingers there 3 seconds too long, and learned the taste of metal behind my eyes. When I lifted my hand, the water kept a bead of itself for a breath, a silver not shining but thinking. It slid from my skin and collapsed back into the hole without a ripple, the way a choir absorbs a voice that has doubted. A ring formed where I had touched, and then was gone. The letters on the floor moved, no, not moved, but my eye learned the order they had kept from me. What had been a filigree resolved into a sentence. Memory bends where power presses. I had seen that sentence once carved into a wall hand-height above a shelf where a pilgrim's map slept under lock. I had run my thumb along the cut limestone until grit embedded under the nail like years. The wall had offered no argument. The well did not either. It simply waited for me to understand waiting. Above us, city bells might have been measuring prayers into portions. Down here, time pooled. I do not know how long I knelt in the small room. Long enough to learn that silence has textures, and this one had layers. The hush of stone keeping itself together, the quiet of water remembering, the nearly inaudible insistence of the letters on the floor wanting to be breathed. Long enough to feel the seam door behind me finish deciding that it would remain ajar, the draft gathering its own courage and making a suggestion of freshness that did not belong in that depth. Long enough for the lantern to teach me what shadows look like when they begin to admit they have origins. When I finally stood, my knees announced themselves like old men announcing weather. I retrieved the lantern, and it lightened, as if the well had released something that had weighed it down from across the room. I stepped backward so the rim would not tempt me again. The circle of inscription met my heel with a politeness that felt like warning. I backed into the larger chamber, then to the stair, and the spiral breathed me upward, into the corridor the archives believed they owned. At the threshold, I paused. There is a courtesy the living owe the uncounted. I placed my palm on the seam, as if to bless the stone or ask its blessing. It was warmer now, or I was. Perhaps warmth is a form of collusion. The stars and the cross shivered in my peripheral, as if I had gifted them attention, and they, being grateful, had stirred. I did not close the door. I left it cracked enough to prove, if I needed proof later, that the night had opened something more than my hunger for disobedience. Enough that, if another set of eyes someday found the courage to trim a wick crooked and look too closely at the limestone, the seam could meet them halfway. I walked the corridor with the lantern at regulation height, the flame now behaving itself in the institutional manner of a pen returning to its inkwell. I passed shelves that had watched me age, boxes labeled in a hand I had once envied, panels that creaked in accents I had learned to ignore. I did not go to my cell. I went instead to the scriptorium, where the night ledger waited, the book where we registered our movements with the humility of servants and the craftiness of men who know that records are most useful when their omissions are artful. I signed my name with a line that said I had been where I should have been, and I made my stomach still long enough that my hand did not tremble. The ink caught the light and held it like a confession, daring me to call it a reflection. I slept badly and dreamed worse. Dreams, in the quiet wing, are a disciplinary issue. We do not speak of them, except to condemn their vanity. Yet the dream had no vanity in it. It had a well whose water was not water, a ring of letters that would not stay flat, and a statue lowered slowly into a black that did not accept it so much as erase its past tenses. The statue had wings made of something like glass, and not glass, a brow circled by 7 small stars that knew their positions the way teeth know the mouth that keeps them. When I woke, my hand burned where the bead had sat and slid and fled back into its own hole. I hid my hand under cold linen and told myself tenderness was not a sign. We lie best first thing in the morning. I went about the next day as if I believed the wall had been wall, the seam, the well a metaphor afflicting practical men. I catalogued a minor heresiarch's pamphlets and tied them up with a ribbon that would hold their scandal as charitably as possible. I corrected a date in a liturgical schedule where a saint had been promoted across centuries to be neighbor to an emperor's ambition. I climbed a narrow staircase to fetch a prayer book whose margin had been salted with a marginalia that crawled when you looked too long. I reminded a novice that beeswax and tallow smoke differently, and that certain inks prefer one or become sulky in the presence of the other. I told myself that competence is a liturgy for those no longer eligible for miracles. I told myself competence would save me from wondering what the water remembers when no one is there to ask it. In the afternoon, sunlight angled through a high window set to convince the faithful that even stones can know noon. The light fell across a drawer that stuck. I pulled it open and the metal screamed. Within it lay a reliquary plate, an armor fragment stamped with a name that no longer sat on any calendar, the kind of name that leaves a dent in the tongue when you try to say it after its right to be sounded has been revoked. The name had been crossed with a blade, 2 savage lines that bit the metal and then the hand that made them. A slip of paper lay under the plate, official, brisk, bloodless, patronage reassigned, observances suppressed. See calendar for transpositions. I touched the cut and felt grit embed under my nail again, this time not limestone, but the thin dust of a decree that believed itself kind. That night, the well's note followed me through the corridors like a bell that had forgotten where it hung. If you are expecting a vision that tells me what to do, you do not know how institutions protect themselves. They do not send visions, they send appointments. That evening the senior custodian sent for me. He was a man with a spine like a bookmark, and a voice that could place a figure on a map with 2 syllables. He praised my diligence in the ledger, the way my entries never asked for attention. He reminded me of my vow to love the truth in the manner appropriate to my station. He put a key on the table between us and did not slide it toward me. Keys are not slid in the quiet wing. They appear, and the air around them learns a different pressure. A routine inspection, he said. We are standardizing seals. He did not say which seals. He did not look at my hand. There are courtesies in a conversation like that, which feel like blows. I thanked him. I did not ask why the key's teeth were cut in a pattern no door on our floor had ever required. I did not say that standardizing seals is like standardizing the faces of saints. Some things cannot be made uniform without confessing that their differences had been lying for us, doing our work. I took the key and felt it weigh less than its metal. Some weights measure not substance, but expectation. The key wanted to be put into a seam. It is an error to grant longing to objects, yet there I was, inventing desire for a shape cut by a file under a lamp in a room where names are not spoken. I did not go to the seam that night. I waited. Waiting is a weapon in a place that has made patience its armor. I let the memory of the stair dull, so that my feet would not run ahead of my better enemies. I copied a hymn with enough care that the letters might have been men standing to be counted. I trimmed my lantern wick in a way that would not betray me with adventurous light. I went to my cell and wrapped my hand in linen again, and told the bead of burn to confess its cowardice. It did not. It pulsed once, like a small bell rung with 2 fingers. The second night, I went back. I have told you this, not to persuade you that I moved without hesitation into the tunnel that prefers to eat its steps. I tell you to help you see how ordinary the floor felt under my boots, how the corridor's familiarity conspired with my intentions to pretend that I was only checking a hinge, confirming a rumor, counting rivets. Lies we can tell ourselves at the top of a stair are the only blessing we will get below. I reached the seam. The stars and the cross did not greet me, but they did not scold me either. I set the lantern low. I set the key on my tongue without thinking, tasted the metal like a liturgy too well memorized to require belief, and then took it back into my hand, ashamed and amused in equal measure. I pressed the key to the seam where the paper-cut line had been, and the door confessed itself again, pivoting inward with the good manners of a secret that has decided to be kind just once more. The stair welcomed me like a habit resumes a shoulder, an old weight, an invitation to resume a posture you did not know you were missing. I descended and counted nothing. The letters on the inner wall cross, 7 stars. Cross measured me more accurately than numbers could have. At the bottom, the inscribed lines waited with the same patience as the night before, the same prediction that I would come, even if I told no one, even if I told myself I would not. The well's note met me like a name spoken where names are not spoken. I approached and did not touch. I stood with the lantern held away from me, so that any reflection would not have to negotiate my face, so that the water could be nothing in peace. I looked into it, and it did not look back, and in that refusal I felt something like respect. We are taught to adore what sees us. I learned in that moment to adore what refuses. You suppose the first chapter of a confession ends with the door closing, the lantern snuffed, the decision folded and put away like contraband. I will not grant you that tidy mercy. The first chapter ends here, at the rim of a well that rings without rippling, in a room lettered by a language that will not be corralled into the stables of Latin or Greek. It ends with the knowledge that a door exists where a wall was drawn, that a seam responds to a human thumb the way a rumor responds to a human ear, that below a city, Anxious to measure time by bells and commerce, there sits a patient black recording, none of our faces and all of our urgencies. I did not yet know that a statue would someday be lowered, wings like veined glass catching a light that preferred not to admit itself. I did not yet know that the silver dust, beloved of certain inks, has a second calling older than script. I did not yet know why the oldest custodians speak sometimes, in a cadence that makes the air around their mouths look like pages fluttered by a shut window. I knew only this: silence here was not sacred. It was enforced, and I had stepped into a place that enforced nothing but its own existence. When I climbed back toward the corridor's breadth, the lantern trembled and steadied and trembled again. The seam received me, or perhaps I received it. Who receives whom when a secret and a man meet twice? I did not lock anything. Locks are polite fictions. I left the wall to learn my shape by memory alone. On the ledger that night, I wrote more carefully than prayer. Movements ordinary, duties performed, hours as expected. The ink shone with the honesty that paper always feigns. I blew it dry. The light bent across the script like a blessing that had forgotten to ask permission. Above ground, Rome turned, and with it calendars, and with them the narratives we bless to become law. Below, the well held its note, and the letters kept arranging themselves into sentences only the future would be rude enough to read. I slept with my hand open, palm up, as if a coin might be placed there by something that does not understand money. I dreamed of a door on no map, a seam of stars learning to breathe, and the small, icy burn of a single drop that would not admit it had chosen me. In the morning, I told myself this: I am a servant of order. I told myself this: I will go back only to ensure that what I think I saw is properly catalogued. I told myself this: miracles are for the laity. The quiet wing keeps accounts. All of these were lies, but a confession that begins by naming all its lies risks satisfying you too soon. Let this be enough. I have opened the door once, and I have touched the water once. I am still a man capable of saying only once, and making it sound like the beginning of a hymn instead of a vow already broken. In the quiet wing they teach you to worship the ledger before you ever kneel to pray, not because numbers are holier than names, but because numbers do not blush. A name remembers your tone. A number remembers your weight. The ledger remembers both if you let it. I learned its alphabet by lamplight, crouched beside an oak desk that had been polished smooth by elbows that never graduated into shoulders. We were trained to write without flourish, like men who pronounce verdicts. No loops that might become interpretations. No tales that might be mistaken for intent. Every line had to be a corridor you could walk twice, in and out, leaving the same amount of dust with each passage. The ledger's columns were narrow and unforgiving, and in their narrowness our lives found their official width. On the morning after the second descent, I sharpened my nib against pumice and began the liturgy of recording as if nothing below ground had added a new syllable to any word I knew. I wrote of candles checked, of reliquaries dusted, of 2 visiting scholars guided, politely, away from the cabinet that locks itself when lied to. I wrote of a page repaired, its tear laced with silk thread so fine the wound looked like it had decided to close from the inside. I did not write of a seam or a star or a well. The ledger is a place where the world insists on being exactly as described, but the ledger is also a mouth. And sometimes, if you linger over a letter long enough, it will swallow your certainty and return it as a question. The quiet wing's rules are ornate, where they ought to be simple, and simple where they ought to be humane. We catalogued Liber Tenebrarum, the books of the dim, in gloves thin as mercy. We counted chains by links and rings by grooves, worn into wood by centuries of impatience. You learn to lift a chained book the way a nurse lifts a sleeping child, enough support that the chain does not complain, enough respect that the lock does not think you are trying to seduce it. You never forget the weight of iron that insists a page should not be turned without supervision. The chain is not there to protect the book from you. It is there to protect the book from its own talent for telling the truth. I had first touched argent ink in the second year of my novitiate, a whisper of silver distilled into black, a hard brightness softened into script. Alchemists called it a stabilizer, though whoever named it had never watched it under beeswax and then under tallow and heard it sing differently beneath each flame. In beeswax, the silver shone and steadied. Under tallow, it sulked, letters swelling at the edges like bruises. We were told this was chemistry. We told the chemistry it had better learn Latin. The atlas, no one was allowed to ask about, sat chained to a lectern near the ledger desk, as if to remind the book of hours what hours actually meant. The atlas did not measure distance so much as obedience. Continents were pinned beneath rings that bit the paper. Brass circles stamped with tiny constellations which, if you traced them with a fingernail, mapped tunnels under the city rather than stars above it. When visitors asked what the brass marks were, we told them they were early attempts at magnification. When they asked why the rings were bolted to the spine, we told them the pages had a tendency to curl. When they asked whether the sea monsters were jokes, we told them sometimes cartographers were poets. Lies do not become truer when told in liturgical tones. They simply become more obedient. One afternoon, Sister Callista of the bindery, a woman with hands like gentled pliers, summoned me with a whistle that could have passed for a bird if the bird had been taught its call by a metronome. She had laid out a folio of hagiographies slated for harmonization, the euphemism we used when a life obstinately refused to be scheduled according to a feast day that had been promised to someone else. The pages smelled of myrrh and smoke and a patient sadness, the aroma of a story taught to stand still. "We're scraping halos," she said, and made it sound like peeling oranges. She offered me a tool, a small, blunt blade with a handle worn to the shape of an argument. It was meant for lifting gold leaf, but today it would be for lifting faces. You do not scrape a face, you coax it to forget itself. The vellum warms beneath your hand. The halo will stay. The features go the eyes first, because eyes remember you in return. The mouth last, because a mouth can still bless after it has been kissed away, and you do not want any accident of sanctity lingering in the leather. When I had finished, the saint remained only as a circle of authority, with no one inside it. Around the void, some scribe a century ago had written vacatus vacated and dated the correction. A neat hand had added the word again in a different ink, a different century. Vacatus. Some spaces have the courtesy to remain empty even after we forget who emptied them. I checked the ledger and found the entry where the saint had been officially deprecated. The phrase felt like accounting, dressed for vespers. A line beneath it read, patronage reassigned to expedite concordance with imperial annals. You could tuck several sins into expedite. You could smuggle a calendar through it. You could drown a century. At noon, I escorted a Jesuit mathematician to the clockworks above the nave, a favor traded through the braided channels that carry permissions like messages wrapped in lead. He needed to examine a pendulum that had begun to argue with itself. We climbed into a throat of beams and bell ropes. He moved with the care of a man stepping through a dream he had not consented to dream. At the platform, he listened to the pendulum the way a physician listens to a prayer and then said, "One tooth is missing." He did not mean in the cog. He meant in the record that decided when the cog should exist. "You keep time," he told me, "by keeping stories straight. When the stories don't, the hours wander." "Phantom time," I said before I could stop myself. He turned, and for the briefest instant the lamplight made a compass of his pupils, radiating lines I recognized from a floor that was not supposed to be on any map. He smiled the way men smile when they have heard a dog speak a human word. "Keep that phrase for the walls," he said. "They have practice." Back in the wing, the afternoon ticked forward with the obedient clatter of keys. I checked a cabinet whose contents learned quickly never to announce themselves. A cage for a small reliquary that refused to stay positioned toward the east. A box of wax seals impressed with papal rings that belonged to men whose portraits had accidentally aged too quickly. A rolled map embellished with a coastline that had crept inland since last it was consulted. The seal on that map had been remelted and repressed so many times that the wax itself had acquired a topography. Ridges like miniature mountain ranges, a valley where an impatient thumb had forced a signature dry. In the lower stacks, I came upon Brother Morris counting candles, lips moving as if the numbers were a rosary more reliable than prayer. He held two kinds of taper, beeswax and tallow. We stocked both because some texts preferred one to the other, and preference in texts, like preference in people, is often a symptom of what can't be said openly. "Your beeswax shipment," he grumbled, "smells like a beekeeper learned his trade from a cook." I knew what he meant. Too sweet, too forward. The argent ink would sulk beneath that sweetness, letters puffing with hurt pride. "Try 2 beeswax to 1 tallow," I told him. "Let them argue themselves thin," he snorted. "You were born to reconcile the irreconcilable," he said. "Be careful what volunteer position you take in heaven." I laughed, and the sound came out more tired than amused. Heaven, in the quiet wing, is a filing system with no mischief left in it. Earth is where mischief takes the shape of policy. The ledger demanded my attention again. A delivery had to be signed for, a portfolio of discouraged diagrams from a sculptor who had been advised to study more cloth and fewer bones. The sketches were red chalk and stubbornness, muscles drawn too honestly, tendons annotated like psalms. A note clipped to the corner in a hand I knew well instructed us to correct proportions by softening the anatomy into edification. I took out my knife, dulled to kindness, and worked the edges until sinew became suggestion and suggestion became piety. The chalk stained my fingers and, later, the basin water when I washed them, a pink faintly metallic as if some small vow had bled. All through the afternoon, the ledger's pages swelled with entries that sounded like obedience. A novice returned 3 grains of sand in a vial labeled, "From the tomb of," and then a name scratched away, the label rewritten in a cleaner hand. We are careful not to reuse vials. Memory clings to glass. A chest of charms. confiscated from pilgrims who insisted that faith is more efficient when it has gears. Rattled softly as I logged it, gears swallowed by velvet, springs coerced into stillness. I checked a small iron gate that opens onto a hallway nobody admits is a hallway. The hinges sighed the way old men sigh, a complaint with politeness smothering it. In the last hour before dusk, the confessor's door, so called because of how it contains what cannot be safely said, stood ajar. Father Valerian, who has the gentlest wrists of any man I have seen sign a condemnation, sat under the spill of light from a clerestory window, his face tilted toward the dust, as if listening to a choir only he had hired. The room is not large. Its shelves are shallows in which heavy truths swim slowly. Men go there to take inventory of what their courage can carry and what must be returned to the shelf with the label turned inward. The ledger for that room is slimmer than it ought to be. Some confessions resist ink. He looked up when I entered. "Brother," he said, and the word landed like a book placed just so on a table weight without threat. "You're limping." I hadn't realized I was. The stairs, it seemed, had adjusted my gait to a rhythm the corridors could hear. "Old shelves," I lied. "New splinters." He gestured to a stool. On the desk beside him lay a small book chained with silver wire rather than iron, the links fine as a spider's boast. Its title plate had been burnished blank. No one had polished it. The book had forgotten its name on purpose. "Help me with this," he said, and slid the book toward the edge where a second pair of hands could hold reverence steady while the chain was unfastened. The wire was cool and surprisingly heavy, as if it had taught itself to be serious. When he opened the book, the first page shone faintly, not gilding, not illumination, more like the residue a star leaves on the back of the eye after you look up too long. The script was crisp, an italic that moved with the serenity of water that knows exactly how deep it is. The margin held small notations, cross-references to calendars no longer in print, cross-outs that treated history like a draft. I recognized the hand. It belonged to a man whose name had been carved out of a lead plate and then written in again by someone unwilling to leave a space untroubled. Father Valerian read aloud 2 lines and then closed the book as if he had caught himself singing in an empty church. "You've been here long enough," he said, "to know how the quiet wing keeps itself quiet." He did not phrase it as a question. He slid a slip of paper across the desk. On it, Custodia Temporis, Custodia Memoriae. Guard time, guard memory. "Everyone thinks the first is the harder task," he said. "They're wrong." I waited. Waiting is a sacrament between men who won't call each other by their first names. "Do you remember your vows?" he asked at last. The ledger of my mind opened obediently. Poverty, chastity, obedience, silence, discretion, accuracy, charity. Not the sentimental kind, the archival kind, where you do not allow the living to pillage the dead for anecdotes. "I remember," I said. "And do you remember," he continued, voice soft as dust on vellum, "the clause about interventions that maintain concordance?" I did. It was written in the kind of Latin that puts the subject of the sentence in chains and lets the verb walk free. I had signed beneath it with a hand too young to suspect verbs of being where manipulation hides. "I remember," I said again. He nodded, as if I had answered a different, larger question. "Then you will understand," he said, "why certain misalignments must be bathed." The word found a landing place inside me that should have been stone and wasn't. Bathed. The well's note rang behind my teeth, gentle as cutlery tapped on glass to interrupt a drunken toast. Bathed, I repeated, and kept my face obedient. He closed the chain again around the book and made the wire sing once, a small, high sound like a gnat deciding to be a violin. Take the night ledger, he said. Inventory. The lower annex. I've submitted the request for access. He did not say which annex. The quiet wing has as many lower places as the city has. Legends. And some of them successfully pretend to be the same. When I left him, the corridor had already begun its evening, a long exhalation that carries the day's heat into corners where compacts have been stored since nobody can remember not storing them. I took up the night ledger as commanded, the book's weight familiar and instructive, and checked the tool roll. Picks for locks that were supposed to be obedient and had started practicing hymns of resistance, wax and a seal for messages that deserved dignity, chalk for drawing a line across a threshold to see which side was liar enough to step over it, and a small pouch of silver dust for inks and for what the request would call ritual residue mitigation. A man can inventory his conscience the way he inventories a room, shelves, drawers, hidden compartments, and that one dusty corner where he stores versions of himself that never had to choose. I did this as I walked, counted each breath, and tried to assign a label: necessary, optional, damning, miraculous. The ledger lay against my palm, warm as a sleeping animal. The stair down to the annex waited where it always waits, because the quiet wing does not move its stairs. It moves the meanings of rooms. I stepped into a damp that knew my name and would not speak it. The letters on the wall, cross, 7 stars. Cross had not multiplied. They did not need to. Their repetitions changed scale rather than number. The further down, the smaller the stars became, the more precise, the more exacting. I set the lantern in its niche, a cradle forged by caution and used by men who never admitted their hands shook. I opened the annex door and let the ledger rest on a shelf that had learned patience from stone. You think perhaps I went directly to the well. I did not. The night had tasks that believed themselves above curiosity. First, the chained books. I checked their links, 3 turns of the wrist for each ring, to make sure the iron had not grown arrogant and brittle. I listened to the way each chain settled. There is a difference between a chain that relaxes because it trusts you and a chain that slumps because it has forgotten how to resist. Second, the reliquary drawers. I pulled 1, then 2, then 3, counting the long vowels of their timbre, making sure the wood remembered the syllable of its life. In the third, a plate again, this one unmarked, haloless, no name, not even a blank scratched, where a name could one day be allowed. I touched it and felt a cold like a forehead that had made its peace with fevers. Third and last before any indulgence, the weeping case. So called because its glass fogs whenever the air learns a secret. Inside lay a small codex, its leather cured in a fashion that makes it sweat when the reader lies. We use it to test ourselves. Father Valerian says that a man who can hold the book while insisting he has never been tempted by knowledge is a man who has never been alive. I took the codex out and cradled it. It stayed dry. Either I had become honest or the book tired. I returned it and wiped the glass clear with a linen that had never touched a mouth. Only then did I let the ledger close itself on a ribbon, as if it had decided to sleep and would resume its testimony later. I turned toward the small room and its black music. The circle of inscription met my foot with an intimacy that made me ashamed of my shoes. The well's surface did not claim the lantern light. It accepted that there are things illumination cannot persuade. I did not touch the water this time. I did something worse. I spoke. "Forgive me," I said, out loud, in a room that puts every syllable on trial for intention. "Forgive me for not knowing what it is I am about to do." Words do not echo here. They hunker down, grow roots, and begin to instruct you. My voice folded into the stone as if stone had been hungry all day for anything that wasn't certainty. I set the pouch of silver dust on the rim and did not open it. I unrolled the tools and did not choose one. I took out the seal and the wax and returned them to their places. I opened the night ledger to a clean line and wrote, "Annex inventory commenced," and beneath it, in the smallest hand I had ever allowed myself, a sentence that would be lost between two strokes if anyone reading did not want to see it. Silence wasn't sacred. It was enforced. The letters on the floor, those not quite Latin, not quite Greek ligatures that look like the shadow cast by grammar, when grammar steps between you and the light, seemed to lean closer. "It is a trick of the eye," I told myself. "It is a trick of the conscience." The well hummed. The hum was pitched to a human jaw. The hum was pitched to the part of a man that votes yes, when the rest of him knows he should abstain. I closed the ledger. I do not know whether, in that moment, the room decided to adopt me, or merely shrugged and allowed me to imagine myself adopted. I know this. A breath came up from the water that smelled like candle wicks, pinched to silence, and like vellum warmed beneath a scribe's wrist. The smell said, "You are late." The smell said, "You are exactly on time." Both are true in the quiet wing. Both will be used against you if you let them. There are gestures you practice so long in secret that when the order comes to perform them, you look like a man appropriating his own handwriting. I reached for the pouch, unfastened the tie, and let a pinch of silver fall into my palm. It lay there like patience. It lay there like a coin minted by a country that no longer exists. "For inks," the request had said. "For residue." The word bath returned to me, not as a sacrament but as a solvent. I did not cast the dust. I could not persuade my hand to trade curiosity for consequence. Instead, I flicked my wrist and watched 3 grains fall. They did not sink. They paused, each a tiny star, then elongated into strokes like the first motions of a letter in a language that has only 5 verbs, all of them to remember. The grains went bright, then dull, then bright again, as if signaling across distances I had no maps for. Then they dissolved, obedient to gravity's version of doctrine. I should have gone then. I should have shut the pouch, rolled the tools, written inventory completed, and returned to a world that claps for men who never clap for themselves. Instead, I leaned over the well and whispered the line, carved on stone, a corridor away. Memory bends where power presses. The water did not change. The room did. It seemed to tilt infinitesimally, the way a picture frame tilts when a building settles, and the eye aches to correct it with a thumb. Something moved in the corner of my seeing, a vector, not a shape. If I had been a braver man, I would have turned and named it. I am not a braver man. I am a man who keeps ledgers and opens doors and scrapes faces from saints with a knife blunted by repentance. I watched the vector until it convinced me it had been dust. When I finally straightened, lantern in hand, ledger under arm, the annex felt smaller, like a thought you have decided to share and therefore cannot be as large as when it was only yours. On the stair, the carved crosses and their 7 stars ticked off my ascent with the patience of an abacus, confident of its sums. At the seam, I paused, listening for footsteps that would carry questions I was not ready to answer. None came. The door resumed its pretense. The corridor resumed its late-night respiration. The ledger resumed its weight. At the desk, I entered the hour with a pen that had stopped pretending to be a feather when the empire taught it steel. I did not lie. I arranged the truth until it looked like the kind of truth the ledger prefers. And then, because the ledger is not only a book, but a habit, and habits can sometimes be more tender than faith, I turned to the back page, where spare columns wait for emergencies, and wrote a word in the narrowest hand I own. An emergency no one would recognize as such. Well, it gleamed for a moment, not with silver, not with guilt, but with the relief of a thing that has finally been named in the place where names are not supposed to be. In the cell, later, I held my palm to the lamp. The skin looked ordinary. The bead's burn had withdrawn from the court of appearances. But when I closed my hand, bones spoke to bones in a dialect of chill. A man can be brave by mistake. A man can be cautious on purpose. I fell asleep, perched between both ledger, under my pillow, hand over my heart, as if either could prevent the other from making its case. A dream, a chain writing itself around a book that insists on being opened. A star that is not a star but a symbol for a door. A pendulum pausing slightly, like a throat before a confession. And a voice not God's, not mine, saying, with the boredom of someone about to become necessary, bathe the misalignments. I woke before matins with the taste of coin in my mouth and a list in my head. It was an inventory of what I could still lose and remain myself. It was not a long list. The ledger waited. The well waited. The city turned its gears. I rose, and the floor under my feet accepted my weight with the same old promise, that it would remember me without insisting that I remember myself. That is the bargain the quiet wing offers. For years I was content with it. For the next few days, contentment would pretend to be an option. Then the statue would arrive, the brow circled with 7 stars, and the word bathe would become a commandment with a chain attached. But that is a later chapter. For now, accept this. I have written the ledger. I have held the chain. I have scraped a saint into vacancy and watched the halo stand guard over nothing. I have opened a seam and closed a mouth and spoken to water that will never admit it heard me. And still, against the arithmetic of obedience, something adds itself to me every time I descend. It is not courage. It is not heresy. It is the memory of a room that refuses to reflect a face and therefore cannot be accused of flattery. It is the memory of a ledger that would prefer me to be a narrower man than I am willing to remain. It is, perhaps, the earliest ripple of a baptism I have not yet agreed to receive. Time, in the quiet wing, is an obedient animal so long as you don't look it in the teeth. The hours kneel on command. The bells lift their throats when a rope tugs them like a leash. Calendars bow to the thumb that turns them. But every creature that obeys too perfectly learns, in secret, the art of refusal. We called those refusals misalignments. The mathematicians called them corrections. The old custodians, who never trusted a noun unless it could carry a blessing and a threat, called them gaps you can fall through. The first gap I ever fell through was a date. It began as a smudge in a registry of papal bulls, a smear so precise it could only have been made on purpose. The instrument was a finger dabbed with pumice, then with wax, then drawn across a year like a cloud. Beneath the smear, the parchment thickened, a subtle ridge scar tissue in paper. I steamed the page with breath, the way Sister Callista taught us, not to erase, but to persuade. The year revealed itself in fractions, a 1 shaped like a picket, a 5 that wanted to be a 3, a final digit half-born, caught between 2 intentions. The ink around it had aged to the color of old plums. The correction, newer, bit into the fibers with a black that still sighed when it met light. A note in the margin, initialed by a hand so self-possessed it could be mistaken for humility, read, "Concordance with imperial annals achieved." Another hand, later, added, "Harmonized to astronomical observations, per advisement." If you pressed your ear to the parchment, you could hear the 2 centuries argue about who had given permission to whom. The bull's content had been about tithes and a bishop who considered holiness and taxation interchangeable. The year mattered only because it made the decree contiguous with a feast, contiguous with a coronation, contiguous with a victory. It was the contiguity that had to be protected. The story had to touch the right other stories, or the power could not flow. That night, I climbed to the clockworks again, keener than was seemly to stand under a pendulum's slow sermon. The Jesuit had left his temporary scaffolding, a plank and 3 nails, an improvised attention that could support the weight of a thoughtful man. The pendulum sighed as it traveled, a barn door of breath. In the sigh, a hitch, a half heartbeat lost, and then found, the sound a widow makes clearing her throat at the will reading. I watched the bob cut the air with patient dialogue. Below, the nave measured faith into benches. Above, the sky kept its own counsel behind leaded glass. When I returned to the ledger, the word concordance had followed me down the stairs and sat on the page like a paperweight. I wrote it, and then I wrote it again, small, smaller. Each time it meant less and insisted more. Concordance is what men say when they want an argument to stop without losing it. It is what we say when we need 2 calendars to pretend to be friends. It is the sound of a clock swallowing the cog it can't digest. The Quiet Wings' private calendars, the ones with their teeth intact, live behind a grate that doesn't squeal. Each leaf is heavy, a year that has learned not to run. We keep Julian in one stack and Gregorian in another, but between them there is a 3rd stack without a proper name. We call it the bridge because a bridge sounds benign. The bridge is a fiction built of arithmetic and apology. For certain reigns, it inserts days. For others, it skims them. It allows a prophecy made on a winter morning to arrive precisely at a summer evening. It lets a saint's martyrdom fall conveniently on a city's founding. It keeps invasions and eclipses from contradicting each other in public. On a late afternoon when the sun was rehearsing its exit, a courier delivered a portfolio of astronomical charts from a collegium whose letters always arrived with a gold dust you could not wash off. The charts were obsessively beautiful. Eclipses rendered like moths opening their wings, transits set against grids that hummed if you stared long enough. The accompanying letter was elegant and hungry. It requested our traditional advice in reconciling observed anomalies with rhythmic expectations. The kind of phrase that brushes a compliment along the grain of your vanity until you purr. I carried the portfolio to the confessor's desk and felt the weight of stars that had been drawn precisely so their imprecision could be hidden in plain sight. Father Valerian read in silence. His eyelids did not move. When he had finished, he tapped the parchment once, a small permission that released 200 possible meanings into the air. They need 3 days, he said. If we give them 2, they will steal the 3rd. If we give them 4, they will sell 1 back to us at a profit. He slid the charts back to me. Begin a draft. Per the concordance of sacred and natural time, let the observation be recorded under the feast of. We'll decide which and the remaining anomalies be entrusted to the bridge for safekeeping. Safekeeping, I repeated, and the word tasted like something that had been stored too long in a cask that once held vinegar. We call lies safekeeping when we've made them useful enough. We call missing teeth smoothed when the clock still smiles. It was in that same week that a pilgrim map arrived from a remote abbey, wrapped in linen and deference. The ink had browned to an honesty no modern hand can counterfeit. The coastline swelled like a tired lung. In the lower margin, a drawing of a fish so baroque it could not have evolved without a committee. But it was not the fish that hooked me. It was a dotted line drawn inland, a pilgrimage route that then curved downward, as if the mapmaker had felt a gravity not usually permitted to paper. The line entered the city, and then, impossible, impudent, descended beneath it, terminating in a small star very like those that stitched the cross on the seam door. "What is that?" asked Sister Callista, peering over my shoulder with the affection of a hawk for a mouse that writes. "An artist's prerogative? Has many blows. An admission," I said, and she raised an eyebrow that had been trained to prefer verbs that do less damage. The dotted line was echoed by a second, very faint, drawn in a different hand and color, as if someone had come later and traced the first with the softest allowable dissent. Between the 2 lines, a note the size of a thumbnail, ad fontes, to the sources. The phrase is scholarly jargon in public and a road sign in private. We submitted the map to the committee that decides the fates of inconvenient artifacts. It returned with a recommendation as polite as a poison: rehouse with devotional ephemera, amend description, remove interpretive elements that imply subterranean pilgrimage. In practice, this meant the dotted line would be described as a decorative flourish, the star as a copyist's error, and the entire lower margin as folk embellishment. I wrote the new label myself, my hand clean, my conscience not. Halfway through, I set down the pen, turned the map, and put my ear to the linen, a child again listening for the inside of a seashell. The paper, of course, said nothing. The linen said, "You already know where it goes." At night, the bridge calendar thickened with pencil. The Jesuits visited after Compline, cheerful and exhausted, smelling of ink and cold air. They calculated with kindness. They made coffee that tasted like burnt clocks. One of them, a pale man with lips like erased lines, tested our patience by insisting that the equinox is innocent, that it only ever wanted to be itself, that the rest was men teaching it manners. He smiled when he said it, and I almost liked him. Then he added, as if discussing the weather, "We accept your 3 days, and in exchange, the feast you promised us last winter moves to a more suitable century." He meant a saint's name would become an emperor's ally. He meant a missing tooth would be installed without anesthesia. We keep a set of bulls in duplicate, a pair of twins that pretend not to know each other. One is the public face, the Latin its best behaved. The other is the draft, scarred with corrections no eye without custody should see. The twins are not the same age. The draft, older, wears the world's first intentions. The public, younger, wears the world's second thoughts. I handled both on a Thursday, the day the quiet wing traditionally courts disaster. The signatures were signed by the same man years apart, his hand earlier all zeal, later all tremor. The later signature was used to approve the earlier draft. The earlier signature was used to justify the later public face. In effect, a hand learned to imitate itself across decades in order to keep a promise no one living had ever heard made. I pressed the two parchments together and felt the raised ink kiss through the fibers like two conspirators checking each other's pulse. There is a practice no one admits to, blowing gently over a line of text to see if dust will rise where it shouldn't. Dust knows where pens have hesitated. Dust knows where time has been asked to double back and pretend it never detoured over the twins. Dust rose in identical puffs at non-identical places. I sneezed and blessed myself and wrote in the ledger, routine comparison of copies. Routine is the most dangerous word we have. It is the floor you fall through smiling. In the lower annex that night, I carried 3 items: the twins, the pilgrim map, and an hourglass whose sand had been reforged so many times it had learned to pass more politely between bulbs. The well did not brighten, it intensified, like a smell turning into weather. The circle of inscriptions flexed a trick of my conscience, or the room's way of olding itself. I set the twins on the lectern and the map beside them. I set the hourglass near the rim where the silver had once stung my skin. Concordance, I said, to the stone that does not pretend to learn new words. Bridge, I added, for the sake of irony. The water hummed, and the hum tightened, as if the well had decided to tune itself in smaller and smaller increments until no human scale could measure how precise it had become. I turned the hourglass. The sand began its patient collapse. Midway, it paused as if one grain had reconsidered. Then it resumed. In that pause, something inside me recognized kin. What do you do with knowledge that will not survive sunlight? If you are a good servant, you write it in a ledger, with syntax so narrow it suffocates while smiling. If you are a coward, you pretend you never heard it speak. If you are neither, if you are the kind of man who opens doors carved into limestone with a thumb that cannot stand untested, you stage a small experiment and promise God you will make the results safe if He allows you to keep them. I laid the pilgrim map over the circle so that the dotted line, the insolent descent, coincided with a radiating inscription. The star in the margin met the star in the floor, paper on stone, intention on instruction. I turned the hourglass again. Sand fell, and as it fell, the map's paper lifted and settled, as if the breath of the well had become a tide just strong enough to persuade fibers to remember how they once were plant. The star did not glow. It agreed, which is worse. I slid the twins atop the map, the draft beneath the public, so that a signature rested above a signature. The hum rose half a pitch. The well did not reflect my face. It reflected the part of me that thought it could still choose not to be implicated. That part looked like a man adjusting curtains while a house burned. I whispered the line carved in stone, and then the Jesuit's phrase, "Rhythmic expectations." "Whose rhythm?" I asked. The well, in mercy or malice, did not answer. I did not open the silver dust. I took one grain from the rim, stuck to a crack with the stubbornness of small truths, and let it drop on the bridge calendar notation I had made in pencil on a scrap. The grain sat, bright as a thought before it learns compromise. Then it sank into the graphite and turned it a shade darker. The correction would hold. The number would behave. The feast would move across centuries like a saint relocated to a different town square, a bronze general riding a horse that had never seen battle. When at last I climbed from the annex, dawn had preheated the sky. The bells above the nave rehearsed their first rehearsal. I had not slept. Men can miss sleep for days and not endanger their souls. They cannot miss doubt for a day without becoming efficient. That morning, Father Valerian called me to the confessor's desk again. He was already seated. The silver-chained book that had forgotten its name lay open, and next to it, a slip of paper written in a hand I was learning more quickly than was safe. Custodia temporis, custodia memoriae. Guard time, guard memory. He gestured to the chair and then to the window. "Listen," he said. Outside, the city recalibrated itself. Carts objecting to cobblestones, birds consulting their ledgers, merchants polishing their arguments. Inside, a different sound, the subordinate ticking of small clocks, shrines to punctuality in a building that insists meaning is always a beat late. "Tell me," he asked, "what is the difference between a calendar and a confession?" "Consent," I said, surprising myself. He smiled in that way he had, the corners of his mouth respectful of gravity. "Good. And what is the difference between a correction and a penance?" "Correction expects to be admired," I said. "Penance expects to be believed." He nodded and slid a parchment toward me. It was a draft decree, unsigned, detailing a modest adjustment. 3 days to be changed to 2 in one place and to 4 in another, the sums evening out for all the wrong reasons. "Write the clean copy," he said. "Use the italic that persuades men they are handsome when they agree with it. Then take the twins downstairs tonight and bathe the misalignments." He did not raise his voice on bathe. He never raised his voice. He changed the temperature of words instead, cooling or warming them until they reached the skin, and the skin admitted them. I wanted to ask why the well. I wanted to say, what are we washing from what? But questions here are racehorses. Breed them too strong, and they break their own legs. I dipped the nib, smoothed the plume of black to a line that would convince a king he had thought of mercy unprompted, and I wrote the decree in a hand so clean a surgeon could have used it as a scalpel. The letters carried themselves with the kind of authority only a lie with good posture can own. When I sanded the page and shook the extra off, the grains hit the desk with tiny clicks, a rain of seconds we had convinced to be ours. That night, I took the bundle the twins wrapped in linen, the map between them like a tongue clamped by teeth, the hourglass, the seal and descended, the crosses and their 7 stars kept count. The room welcomed me not with warmth, but with a recognition that felt like competence returned to its field. The well hummed, and the hum selected a note that found the weakest spot in my jaw. I set everything in order, the way a man sets a table for a guest who might refuse to eat. "Per the concordance," I said, every syllable a bead on a string I was not sure I wanted to own. I placed the public bull first, the draft second, and the map third, paper edges aligned with the circle's spokes. I turned the hourglass, and, when the sand was exactly half spent, I lowered the public bull into the hum. The parchment hovered over the water as if reconsidering dignity. Then it settled into the black without getting wet. It did not float. It rested, supported by something that wasn't surface and wasn't mercy. The well does not devour, it edits. Letters softened, not erased, tenderized, as meat is tenderized in kitchens where cooks know the body's habits. The date brightened where the smear had been, then dimmed, then brightened again, as if the first intention and the second were debating which of them loved the story more. The signature steadied the tremor that had crept into the older hand, learned from the younger how to fake youth for one more year. When I lifted the parchment, it was dry. The ridge beneath the date had thinned, scar tissue smoothed, missing tooth replaced. The draft followed. The corrections that had bitten into the fibers relaxed their jaws. Pencil ghosts chose sides. A sentence that had accreted subordinate clauses like barnacles dropped one and then two, revealing the hull of meaning beneath the incrustations. I recognized the hull. It had sailed a different sea when it was first built. I lowered the map last. The dotted line, in defiance of the quiet wing's polite intentions, did not smudge. It sharpened, each dot a thought that had finally found its period. The star in the margin steadied, becoming less like an ornament and more like a coordinate. I felt the urge to laugh, and then to cry, and then to tip the hourglass and end it. Instead, I breathed. The breath smelled like extinctions. The map lifted, as if the well were returning a favor it had not been asked. When the hourglass emptied, I removed the map and the twins. The room settled into the hold of its own gravity. The letters in the floor looked pleased with themselves. I have never forgiven them for that. On the way up, the stair counted me with its crosses and its 7 stars. At the seam, I paused and asked out loud, to no one I would admit under oath, what is the difference between keeping time and keeping a secret? The door understood me well enough to remain a door. I returned the twins to their drawer. Public above, draft below, as custom demanded. I wrote the hour into the ledger, and the word bathed in the code we use when we want to be blameless in perpetuity. Then I sat, pen in hand, waiting for my hand to stop vibrating with the tone the well had taught it. It did not stop. It learned to vibrate more politely. In bed, hand over heart, ledger under pillow, I rehearsed arguments to comfort a younger version of myself, that calendars are humane when they make history less cruel, that prophecies must be met halfway or they become orphans, that a saint cannot protect a city if his feast wanders away from the danger. But even as I consoled him, I knew that the most dangerous thing to them is not a saint with a feast that drifts. It is memory coming back with its original teeth. Morning arrived with the usual bribes, bread, light, obligations, the cowardly mercy of routine. Father Valerian asked only for my ink and my steadiness. The Jesuits sent thanks gilded with second requests. The bridge calendar thickened into a causeway, and somewhere under the city, a well rang on without ripples, its note finding each man who had ever bent a year to fit a story, and asking, in a pitch no ear can refuse, "What exactly have you done?" I knew then that time was not the only ledger we were keeping. Memory had its own columns, and in one of them, in a hand none of us would admit to recognizing, a new entry had been made. Angelus Decidens preparation authorized. The clock smiled, showing all its teeth. I smiled back, counting the missing ones. There are maps that tell you where you are, and there are maps that tell you what you've agreed to forget. The chained atlas did neither. It behaved like a witness. It remembered the parts everyone else rehearsed, and then, with an almost indecent patience, kept a second set of directions under its breath. It sat on a lectern whose oak had learned to tense around bolts, as if the wood had decided to mimic muscle. Brass rings looped the spine in increments that matched no known system but all the important ones. The chain fastened not to the desk, but to an iron brace sunk into the floor like a verdict. Most atlases begin with north. This one began with below. The first plate wasn't a world at all, but a circle of tunnels, the city inverted like a bowl held to a well. Constellations, not on the sky but stamped in the margins, formed a second network, a secret of stars that aligned with the intersections underground rather than the heavens above. A man who wished to appear competent could say this was metaphor. A man who wished to remain useful would say nothing at all. The first time I was permitted to turn its pages without supervision, Father Valerian stood as far away as a man can and still be called present. For continuity, he said, meaning two things at once, that I should continue the work that had drawn me down staircases I wasn't supposed to name, and that what the Atlas believed should not be interrupted by my astonishment. I lifted the cover like a reliquary. The chain tightened with a soft clank, a warning disguised as etiquette. The Atlas fell open to a plate around the 30th. A map cross-hatched with tunnels that once smuggled water and now smuggled intent. Each corridor bore a letter that pretended to be Latin until you squinted. Then the letters rearranged into a kind of arithmetic that counted in distances measured by prayers surviving certain purges. In the margins, the small stamped stars, 7 again and again, made a compass rose that refused the cardinal directions and insisted instead on other loyalties: forbearance, omission, plausible deniability, ritual. Callista joined me uninvited, which is the only way she ever joined anyone. She set a palm on the oak and leaned. "It doesn't want to be flat," she said, and I understood. The Atlas had been trained to curve around a globe of meanings no one would draw in public. We called in a Jesuit, which is to say we consented to have mathematics speak to paper. Brother Odo arrived smelling of cold air and chalk. He is the kind of man who can fold a theorem into a smile and make both look like hospitality. He slid a finger across the ring of stars and hummed, "Not navigational," he said, "or not only, these are phase marks." He spoke as if the Atlas were a clock that had forgot itself and needed to be reminded softly, the way you remind a child of the name of a distant aunt at a funeral. "Phase of what?" I asked. "Rites," he said, and his mouth made the plural regretfully. "Openings that don't like to be forced. Crossings that resent showing up when called by men with thin faith. Rosicrucians, men who dress their curiosity in roses, the way soldiers dress their fear in medals, came twice that month. They never touched the Atlas. They admired it with their heads turned slightly aside, as if to spare its dignity. They brought a ledger bound in a leather that had cured itself. Inside were diagrams that looked like the offspring of an astrolabe and a confession. Their spokesman, A silver-haired gentleman whose cufflinks had more geometry than a cathedral pointed to our map's star margins, and then to an engraving in their book, a circle inscribed with Latin so angry it had forgotten grammar. "Your stars," he said, almost kindly, "are our gaps. You build with presence. We build with absences. Both stand." Father Valerian offered them coffee, made in a pot older than anyone alive would admit. The Rosicrucian raised his cup, but his eyes stayed with the atlas. "You keep time down there," he said, quietly. "We are trying to keep it from eating us alive up here." It was the closest thing to a compliment I have ever heard dressed as a warning. Not all visitors announced themselves. Some arrived as pages detached from directories, as footnotes divorced from their husbands. A page of names saints deprecated. Their feast days moved as if moving a date could evacuate. A body fell into my lap one evening, like a leaf that had lost patience with its tree. The page listed the vacated, but not the ones the public already dimly knew. These were not merely removed, they were redistributed. A martyr from a minor port city, excised and then borrowed to bless another town's aqueduct. A healer known for setting bones, reassigned to a dynasty's favorite midwife. Hagiography as ledger. Here a subtraction, there a deposit, the balance confessed among candles. At the bottom, a line in a hand that preferred knives to pens. Reconciled to imperial memory. If you can reconcile a body to a memory, you can reconcile a century to a sentence. The atlas understood the trade in bodies better than I wanted it to. One plate, numbered wrong, on purpose, showed a procession route not along the streets, but through the substructures of a basilica, scaffolding the souls of the city like beams for a ceremony only the foundations would witness. Symbols I had seen on reliquary plates, nicks in the metal where a name had been unnamed reappeared in the tunnels, a grammar of erasure taught to stone. In a locked drawer under the atlas, we kept a supplement titled Itinerarium ad fontes roads to the sources. Its cover smelled of oil and rain, and the memory of men who thought the word source could be domesticated. Inside, each folio mapped a well. Most were older than the walls that now politely enclosed them. One was newer. The silver well had a page all to itself. Its circle was inked with a metallic powder that dulled touch, as if to discourage fingers from becoming permissions. Around the circle, 7 inscriptions curved like ribs. The text was not Latin. It was a notation that made language behave, lines braided around lines, as if 2 alphabets had agreed to share a single spine. Someone I am afraid I can name now, had inked 3 small glyphs in the margin beside the silver circle. The glyphs were repeats of the star that stitches the cross on that seam door. Next to them, Angelus decidens, sponsio praeparata. Fallen witness, contract prepared. Contract. We use contract when we do not have the stomach for covenant. We use covenant when we need the contract to bleed. The orders do not confide in ledgers. They leave trails in ink formulations and procurement lists. That week, I was told to inventory the bindery stores, gall ink, lamp black, the silver salts we add when a text is expected to endure our corrections. Shipment logs carry more truth than sermons. In the margin of a purchase order for argent powder, a note. For inks, for plates, for the line tapered into discretion. The quantity ordered would have lasted 3 scriptoria a decade. We were 1 scriptoria learning how to count in months. Callista clicked her tongue as she read. Either we are founding a bank, she said, or we're going to make a lot of things look like they always looked. She said it like a woman who has loved both faces and masks, and knows which lasts longer. A rumor filtered to us like water through stone. A sculptor in Trastevere had been commissioned to cast a figure not in bronze, not in marble, but in a compound whose principal virtue was to remember being washed. The invoice called it compositum argentium, but a man in the courtyard pronounced it more plainly, light that has curdled. The compound took polish reluctantly, as if it knew it would be asked to hold a reflection and preferred to be polite about refusing. The statue it would become had a name not to be spoken by men in my position. I spoke it anyway, softly, into a linen that I then burned. Names can be rinsed from rooms by fire. You cannot rinse your own mouth. Artists came and went, summoned to correct proportions, to drape two honest muscles in anatomies that would never shock widows at vespers. One brought a sketch for approval, a wing precise to the last ligament, rooted in a shoulder blade like a promise no surgeon could excise. Father Valerian palmed the paper with tenderness and slid it back. "Veil it," he said. "The truth's eyes are tired." The artist left with a frown that could have been envy's little brother. The next time I saw him, in the nave, his eyes avoided the crucifix and measured instead the shadow beneath the organ loft, where men like me learn to stand between a story and the part of the story that bleeds. The Jesuits returned with calculations disguised as apologies. "The equinox has behaved badly," Odo told me, and placed a slip on the atlas like a child being introduced to a distant relative. His slip bore a pattern of numbers that wanted to be months. "We can offer you a corridor of days," he said. "The corridor leads precisely where you have wanted to go since you were 12 and read your first life of a saint." I did not remember wanting a corridor at 12. I remembered wanting a key. But perhaps all keys are corridors, once you've taught them to do more than open. After Compline, Father Valerian handed me a letter to copy. The original lay under a cloth like an illness. It was addressed to a man who wore a ring that kissed wax and expected wax to confess its sins. The letter's body requested aid in the alignment of a witness to a canonical memory, and then in a smaller hand added, "Argent required, atlas to be closed to casual scholars, prepare the well." That last clause was not a request. It was a ritual breathing through a sentence. I copied it in the italic that persuades kings they have been merciful for choosing to sign what we place before them. There is a cupboard that opens only when scolded in a dialect no one teaches on purpose. It holds the tools that serve in rooms we do not list on tours, ladles that have never seen soup, brushes whose bristles refuse color, basins of a metal that oxidizes into something like sleep. I was told to polish them. I did, and felt as though I were shining an argument I had not yet heard. In the back of the cupboard, a cradle with straps, the kind used to lower a body without bruising it. The straps were new. Their leather had not yet learned wrists. While I cleaned, Callista whispered, "They will call it a rehearsal." She did not look at me. She did not need to. "They will call it a rededication, or something that sounds like a feast day waiting for cake. But it will be a washing. The thing about washing is, sometimes it makes the dirt choose a different face." "Do you know the name?" I asked, which is not a question we ask. She toyed with a spool of thread, as if the thread might sew our mouths shut. "Everyone knows the name," she said, so softly the air refused to carry it to the shelves. We simply agree not to remember that we do. The Rosicrucians sent wine and questions. Their courier, a woman with the posture of a violin, delivered a sealed note to Father Valerian with no more drama than a man delivering laundry. He read it and then set it on the atlas, where it seemed to accept being in the presence of a larger arrogance. They ask for courtesy, he said, and warn that courtesy has limits when the river thinks it's an ocean. He meant the well. He meant that our habit of baptizing misalignments had begun to displease men who bathe their consciences in other substances. He did not say we would stop. We didn't. The next night, the atlas's chain sounded 3 soft notes. As I opened to the well's plate notes, like a thought knocking on its own skull, I traced the radiating inscriptions with a fingertip and felt, under my skin, a grid that wasn't the city's but mine, a network of vows and the doorways between them. We do not often notice that our promises have alleys. In the quiet wing, science is permitted, art is corrected, history is rehearsed, until it forgets improvisation. Memory is our only dangerous freedom, which is why, when I found the small notebook wedged behind the atlas's brace, wedged there by a hand that wanted retrieval but could not afford discovery, I opened it with hands that remembered prayer without knowing what for. The notebook was the size of a man's last letter home. On its first page, a diagram of the well, and, beside it, a marginal note in a hurried hand. When washed, the witness carries less. When the witness carries less, the city forgets better. Beware the day the witness refuses. Beneath, another line, older ink. It refused once. Every institution tells a story about the one night its machinery refused to run. The quiet wing has our own. Smoke thickened in the stair. The well's note slipped a half-tone nobody could bear. A candle blew itself out, where breath cannot follow. We tell it as a miracle, which is to say, as an inconvenience that later turned into doctrine. The notebook told it differently. The refusal coincided with a summer of plague and a winter of schism, and the names dearest to a certain faction did not fade the way calendars prefer. Someone cut the chain to the atlas that night. The ring marks are still in the lectern's grain. They look like healed piercings. The next morning, logistics began to dress themselves in vestments. A crate arrived from the foundry, the manifest disguised as a donation to a distant parish wagon wheels and candlesticks. Beneath the candlesticks, the composite, plates, braces, a crown-like circlet set with 7 hollow sockets. The circlet was stamped with those little stars and a single word on the inside, where only the bearer would feel it. Recordare, remember. We use remember when we want obedience to feel like love. We assembled a frame in the annex with the reverence kept for scaffolds around saints. The straps waited for willing wrists. The basin waited to be called a font. I brought buckets of water from a cistern registered under a name a pope once wore and then didn't. The water clinked in the buckets like glass deciding whether to shiver. I ran my hand through it and felt the grain of ground years, the mineral that tells a stone who it has been. I added by instruction, not by understanding a scoop of the silver powder. The water refused to cloud. It accepted the metal the way a bruise accepts a thumb. At Compline, Father Valerian permitted himself a sentence of candor. When we say alignment, he said, gazing at nothing, we mean mercy. He let the word soften until it would have dissolved on anyone else's tongue. Mercy for whom? I asked, unable to bring myself to lower my voice enough for manners. He lifted his eyes to mine, and in them I saw the tiredness particular to men whose virtue has been used like a lever. For the story, he said, or it will break under its own believers. The orders that whisper never speak in unison. A Jesuit will call it pedagogy. A Rosicrucian will call it balance. An archivist will call it stewardship. A politician will call it necessary, which is the most honest word power ever allows itself. When the council met half in person, half by notes that took longer to write than to read, the debate was not whether to proceed. It was whether to confess to ourselves what we were about to do. The minutes record euphemisms the way ships record barnacles, troubling only when they slow you. Repatriation appeared thrice, rectification twice, baptism not at all. The silver well's name, never. The Atlas, as ever, watching without eyes. That night I slept in my cell with the Atlas's ghost leaning against the cot. I dreamed of a hand lowering a figure not into water but into a sentence. The sentence closed over its head like a lid. Above, the city continued to ring itself orderly. Below, something learned it always learns to sing along. In the morning, we rehearsed the route. Not the public one with incense and boys struggling under gold, but the route men take when a ritual wants to happen without witnesses. From the sculptor's yard to a side door near the transept, down a corridor, nobody calls a corridor, through a room where faces are loosened from saints with knives that apologize for being necessary, past the chained Atlas, which pretended to be sleeping but tugged once, twice, to see who had the key today. The straps lay across the cradle like well-behaved serpents. The circlet waited in its velvet. The basin shimmered an argument. Odo measured angles and muttered about phases. Callista wound linen around what would someday be called a brow. I wrote the last of the labels that would help the museum upstairs lie politely about where certain artifacts had spent the night. Workshop of unknown master, composite reliquary mount, 16th-17th C. Acquisition by bequest. A reliquary without a relic is a mouth without a tongue. We teach mouths to speak anyway. When the crate finally arrived under the candle's patience, we pried nails with a gentleness reserved for bones. The figure under the straw was not marble and not bronze. It had the pallor of moonlight, remembered by a cave. Wings folded along its back like promissory notes. The face wore no face, smooth, as if a sculptor had finished the work and then apologized to the future. The circlet fit the brow as if the brow had been cast to suit it, which of course it had. The sockets waited for stars. We would not give them stars. We would give them something kinder to control. I will not summarize the vows we said. Vows spoken near the Atlas have a way of reappearing in the margins of maps years later, annotated by men with different handwriting and the same intentions. I will tell you only this. When we lifted the figure, it was lighter than fear and heavier than consent. When we carried it past the Atlas, the chain did not stir. The lectern's oak did. A chair's flinch beneath a man who has told a joke he should not have told. The last thing before we descended was the ledger. I wrote one line with a hand a surgeon would have mistaken for serenity. Per instructions, preparatory movements executed. And then, because the habit of truth sometimes catches you the way a hook catches a sleeve, I added a second in ink so pale it would fade by advent. The Atlas knows. You will want me to tell you that I hesitated on the stair, that the crosses and their 7 stars seemed to brighten with pity, that the well's hum resolved into a hymn. I can give you none of that. The stair was a stair. The crosses were crosses. The stars were stamped metal, tired of being metaphors. The hum was a pitch a human jaw can carry if the man grinds his teeth often enough while sleeping. What I can give you is this. Halfway down, Callista squeezed my wrist the way a midwife measures a pulse and said, "If it refuses, don't be the first to notice." Odo coughed numbers into his sleeve and pretended they were prayers. Father Valerian walked as if his feet were remembering a field he had been forbidden to name since he was young. At the threshold, the circle of inscriptions welcomed us with a small expansion, the way a chest expands before a long-held breath. The basin stood ready, its silvered surface an unmade imperative. We set the figure in the cradle. The straps learned the weight. The circlet learned the room. "Mercy," Father Valerian said, "not to us." The word went nowhere and lived there. The atlas upstairs kept its chain still and listened. The orders that whisper arrived in the room without entering it, the way a smell of rain enters a church. Before the doors, remember what hinges are for. I took up the ledger and wrote the hour in the code that tells the future how to be kind to us. Callista loosened the first strap. Odo nodded to a clock that had never seen daylight. Father Valerian lifted his hand, palm out, as if to bless, as if to push back a tide no one else could see. We lowered the witness toward the silver well, and the hum, gentle until then, scholarly became, for the span of a heartbeat, a note not meant for men. That is where I will leave you. Not because the rest is unsayable, but because confessions are measured, not spilled, and because you must meet the next sound the way I did, unprepared, yet unmistakably expected. There are silences that feel like velvet drawn across a painting to protect it from dust. There are silences that feel like hands over a mouth to protect a lie from air. The silence in the chamber was neither. It felt like a room listening to itself, remember? We arranged the witness in the cradle, as if arranging a sentence with too many commas. The composite light that had curdled took the straps without complaint, the way a body burdened by vows takes a belt and calls it peace. The circlet settled onto the smooth brow. Its 7 hollow sockets waited with the polite entitlement of lampstands that had once been promised flames. We did not give them stars. We gave them emptiness, because emptiness is safer to supervise. Odo counted us into the right. Not with numbers. Numbers are a different liturgy, but with breaths. A measured inhalation that became a metronome. Callista checked the leather where it touched the shoulder ridges, palm pressing just enough to ask the space underneath to confess. Father Valerian stood at the head, his hand raised, not blessing, not command, something older. The posture of a man standing between a city and the price it prefers to pay. I kept the ledger at the edge of the circle where inscriptions run like stitches. The page had already learned the shape of the hour. I had written the code. Repatriation initiated. It is astonishing how gently the truth behaves once you have starved it of pronouns. "Proceed," Father Valerian said, which in our mouth means begin remembering the way we agreed to be remembered. The cradle's pulleys whispered. The straps slipped. The witness descended. The well's hum rose, as if considering generosity. Then it found the note I had felt once before in my teeth. the one that turns bone to tuning fork and makes thought wobble like a candle under a sigh. The surface did not brighten, it concentrated. Argent powder sifted from Callista's scoop in a thin veil that did not fall so much as decide where the air would no longer carry it. It laid itself across the water, and refused to be called a reflection. Odo's voice slipped into the right. Not Latin, not Greek. That braid of syllables the old custodians used when they needed grammar to kneel. I answered where I was trained to answer. Father Valerian's responses were low and exact, like a man laying bricks under a door while the guests are still dancing. As the witnesses' feet met the silver, the hum narrowed to a line so fine it could cut without breaking skin. The circlet chimed once a small, shocked sound, like a wineglass discovering its own fragility, and then quieted, ashamed of having been audible. We did not lower the figure all the way. The rubric called for immersion to the breast, wings above the surface, brow forward to meet the memory. I saw that word on the page the day I copied it. Memoria occurrenda, the memory to be met. In our work, memory is not an archive you enter. It is a courier you meet halfway on a road no one will admit exists. Name, Father Valerian said. The rite does not name the angel, it names the city. Cities are easier to baptize. They submit to water without disputing origins. He spoke the first of Rome's unofficial names, the one the orders use when they want the stones to listen. It tasted like ground basil and iron, like summer at noon in a courtyard where boys have been warned not to run. He spoke the second name, older, a syllable that began low and ended in a question. Name, he repeated, and then the third, which is not a name but a permission, the agreement that what is about to happen will be remembered as something else. Callista's face was composed into an expression that would be mistaken for indifference by anyone who had never coaxed a mouth from a saint. Odo murmured phase counts under his breath, fingers making small apologetic motions in the air, as if drawing corrections he would later deny. I held the ledger stiff against my thigh, and felt the hum ascend through the book's board into my hand. The page trembled. The ink, not yet dry in its last line, shivered like a courtier learning a king has died. The first shift arrived like weather. The inscriptions in the floor came into alignment with the circlet's empty sockets, spokes of a wheel accepting a load. The well's blackness resolved into layers of darker and darkest, not depth but strata, as if what we call water had been shelving itself for centuries in anticipation of this exact hour. Between those layers, the argent dust formed the faintest character's alphabet as condensation, meaning as breath on glass. I could not read them. I could feel their intention crawl under my nails. The witness leaned forward at the waist, obedient to gravity and command. Silver licked the smooth brow. The hum slid half a pitch. I saw then what the rite is built to prevent a man like me from admitting even to himself. The well does not cleanse, it calibrates. It adjusts not the witness, but the field of memory around it, the way a lens adjusts distance by insisting both objects share a single focal plane. The rite's verbs, wash, align, restore, are housekeeping for the conscience. The act's physics are crueler and more honest. They make a city and a story agree. Recite, Father Valerian said, but he did not mean words. He meant the order of events. Which king followed which saint, which feast paired with which victory, which eclipse with which uprising, which woman's hand found bones, and which bishop kindly authenticated them on the correct afternoon. I spoke. Odo spoke. The room learned our cadence and began to anticipate us, the way a choir that has sung together too often starts to soften before the conductor lifts his hand. When the circlet's hollow sockets moved over the radiating inscriptions, something like a current stirred. The sockets stayed empty. The air refused to fill them with even imagined light. Nevertheless, the lines on the floor answered as a page answers a pen, patient, resigned, miraculous. The first realignment was small. A saint, once allowed to die in March, discovered his martyrdom in September. The atlas upstairs slid his halo across a map nobody reading would know to equate with an aqueduct that required blessing that autumn. The second was not small. A sequence of popes learned to trade birthdays the way bankers once traded ships, on paper, in good faith, before the cargo arrived. I felt the change climb my jaw and rest behind my eyes like a headache that had been taught etiquette. "Hold," Callista said sharply. "Palm up," the way she stops a novice from overscraping a chin. The witness had tilted an inch too far. The straps took the complaint. Odo adjusted the pulley. Father Valerian stared at the black surface with a gaze that has unscrewed other men's pretensions with no visible rotation. "Continue," he said. We continued. The well began to speak without sound. "This is not poetry." The metal rim vibrated against my knuckles on the ledger's spine. Tiny translations nobody else in the room acknowledged hearing. The hum's harmonics introduced themselves like cousins at a wake. A word, wordless, but meaning rose from the surface and positioned itself between my teeth. Inventory. Not command, not request. A category. The room had tagged me. I felt suddenly as if my bones had been entered in a catalog and given a location code, lower annex clerical discretionary. Then, the drop. It fell from the witness's right wingtip. No one saw the wing move. It cannot move. We had strapped it correctly. Callista does not have bad days. But from the angle where the composite feather joined the curdled light, a bead formed. It was not water. It was not silver. It was both, or it was the thought that makes both behave. It hung, a perfect decision, then let go. It landed on the back of my hand where the ledgers give you calluses like maps of rivers. It burned like ice and left no mark but a knowledge. When I say knowledge, I do not mean information. Information is what we clip into files and send to men who collect reasons. This knowledge was a room opening behind my sternum and admitting a crowd. They carried no banners and recited no theses. They stood. Some had names that felt like the edges of coins rubbed to extinction. Some were only dates, sticky with the glue of an old calendar. Some were smells myrrh, tallow, winter breath in a stairwell where a door has just remembered it can pivot. They were not ghosts. They were questions. Who replaced me? Why did a feast move like a child after divorce? Who taught the star to sit in a margin and pretend it was decoration? When did the atlas forget north? Which summer did you call winter to make a prophecy behave? I did not speak. To answer would be to participate. To refuse would be to consent. I let the bead's cold distribute itself into my blood like candor. "Half," Odo murmured. The hourglass was gulleting its middle. Father Valerian's eyes flicked to the circlet, then to me, just once, and he read my face the way a man reads a line in a book he is not sure he has paid for. His voice found a new timbre, a priest shifting from doctrine to tenderness without changing vowels. "Hold steady," he said. Not to the witness, to me. We lowered the figure further. The silver kissed its smooth cheeks and clung, beating there as if reluctant to call anywhere else home. The inscriptions in the floor began to pulse, not visually, but in the way your foot knows a distant procession before your eye does. My ledger page brightened and dimmed with the hum's minute waves, the ink's sheen obeying a tide older than oil. We spoke the clause about eclipses. The well obliged us by smoothing a chronology that had resisted kindness. We spoke the clause about the plague year some faction prefers to call chastisement. The well did not oblige. The hum dropped a heartbeat. The water's blackness stratified again, this time into 5 layers, each like a shelf in a library where books have been recalled, and the dust is making its case. The circlet sockets caught the change like ears. "Proceed," Father Valerian said, calm. Odo nodded, a man making notes in his head on a music the Academy will pretend it cannot transcribe. Callista looked at me and then away. The way we look from a friend's face to the road when something heavy is being carried, and we are not the ones under it. "Angelus decidens," I said for the first time, breaking the instruction to leave the figure unnamed. The hum shivered. The witness did not move, cannot move, but the room shifted around it like an audience leaning forward without knowing it has agreed. We arrived at the clause about the vacated. I felt it approach before the words came, a weather, low and persuading, like the pressure that makes old wounds remember rain. "Recorder," the circlet said against my skin, not audibly, not written, but in the way metal can announce its allegiance by temperature. "Remember." We say remember when we want obedience to feel like love, but memory is not a leash. It is a mirror that refuses to flatter. The rite requires at this point the pouring of a second veil of argent finer, sifted through cloth. Callista lifted the pouch. The dust flowed like flour given an opinion. It spread across the well's skin and briefly wrote an alphabet that was neither ours nor theirs. I saw in that glimmer the letters align into a word I did not know I knew. Return. Not command. Description. I thought then of the atlas, of the night the chain had been cut, of the ring marks that looked like healed piercings, of a city that had once refused to trade a century for a prophecy and had paid in bodies instead. The well remembered that refusal. The room smelled like a wick pinched between wet fingers. We had arrived at the hinge in the rite where mercy and control are allowed to use the same spoon. Father Valerian spoke softly, and the lines in his face deepened into something compassionate enough to be mistaken for cruelty by anyone who has never had to choose between 2 kinds of harm. "Official memory," he said, "be restored." The hum, for the first time, answered as if it had been addressed by someone it could not afford to disappoint. The layers of blackness settled into one. The inscriptions held their breath. The ledger in my hand cooled, the page tightening like skin over a healed wound. The map in my head, those dotted lines inland, the star in the margin wavered. The saint whose face I had scraped to a vacancy dimmed another shade. The popes switched birthdays with the ease of men exchanging hats before a storm. And then the mistake mine, though no one will record it. I let my left forefinger brush the water as I steadied the ledger. It was the lightest touch, a punctuation, nothing more. The hum snagged on the tip of my nail and pulled a thread through the skin straight into my chest. The beads, cold in my hand, sparked. For an instant shorter than any hourglass can be taught to measure, the well reflected a face, not mine, never mine but a face smoothed to anonymity, a halo without occupant. and behind it, like a palimpsest refusing erasure, a second face, tired, tender, stubborn, the kind of sanctity that survives without feast days, the kind that prefers kitchens to councils. She looked at me. Not pity, permission. I inhaled, and the right shivered. The circlet's sockets rang 7 thin notes too pure to be secular. Odo flinched. Callista's hand found the strap and tightened in a single mothering tug. Father Valerian's eyes did not leave the surface. He lowered his raised hand 1 inch and said a word not in the rubric, enough. He did not mean stop. He meant, do not ask the well to be kinder than we are. We drew the witness back a span. The silver slid from its brow in a sheet, smaller beads breaking away like a blessing that has missed its timing. The hum receded from the frequency that turns bone into honesty. The inscriptions loosened, the way a mouth does when it has decided not to say the sentence it was certain would win the argument. Close, Father Valerian said, not to us, but to the room, as if the chamber itself had ears and the humility to obey. We raised the witness. The straps learned their new work. The circlet cooled. The sockets empty, thank God. Empty released the floor's attention. Callista laid linen over the brow as if the figure could catch cold. Odo extracted his breath from the right, leaving it still self-sustaining, like a top that has been spun and chooses discipline. I set the ledger down and wiped the silver from my hand with the corner of my sleeve. The stain did not show. Knowledge never stains where uniforms expect to be laundered. No one spoke for a full minute. Minutes in that room are longer than anywhere else. They are built with geological patience. At last Father Valerian nodded once. Official memory restored, he said. The line has been said after 1,000 smaller cruelties that called themselves corrections. Usually, it satisfies. Tonight, it sounded like a man convincing a child. The story ended where the book happened to run out of pages. We reversed the motions. The cradle's pulleys sang an honest work song. The figure, heavier now or we weaker, reassumed the weight in its composite, the way men reassume a name at the border. We covered the basin. We reseated the ledger in its cloth. Callista's hands shook once the tremor a seamstress gets when a seam has agreed to lie and she knows it will tear later with greater drama. Odo leaned against the wall and lost his scholastic paleness to a flush that made him look, for the first time since I had met him, like a mammal. At the threshold, Father Valerian paused and turned back toward the well with no theatricality. Gracias, he said. Thank you, spoken the way a man thanks a horse that has allowed itself to be bridled one more time. Then he met my eye. On his face, a question, not about the right, about me. He did not ask it. He did not have to. The drop had chosen a witness. Upstairs, on the stair where crosses and their 7 stars measure ascent like rosary beads, Callista squeezed my wrist again and this time did not pretend it was about pulse. You felt it, she said. Not quite a question. I did, I said. I could not say what. The words would have converted knowledge into evidence. Evidence is what gets archived. Knowledge is what survives. Odo, regaining his good manners, began to talk about phases and success and elegant compliance. He used the Academy's tone for pretty problems solved with prettier algebra. I let him talk. Sometimes we keep each other from drowning by throwing each other books. In the anteroom, we unstrapped the witness and laid it on the trestles. The circlet left a faint ring on the smooth brow, the way a wedding band leaves a claim on skin after a long day of scrubbing. Callista dried the water that was not water with linen that would later be burned without ceremony. She tucked a corner under the wing and pressed as if tucking a child. The composite cooled, learning the temperature of stone again. Inventory, I said, out loud, startling myself. The ledger had not left my hand, as if it had decided I was its scabbard. I wrote the hour. I wrote the ritual's title with the formal script we use when we need to persuade posterity we were serious. I left a line. Then, with a nib barely damp, I made the smallest mark I have ever made in a book, a dot between two letters. A mistake any later clerk would correct with the practiced flick that courts invisibility. I left it there. A dot can be a door if you refuse to believe in punctuation. We carried the figure along the private route, through rooms that now smelled of silver and linen and the faint animal tang of a fear that had not confessed in time. The chained atlas did not rattle its chain. It pushed a page, a breath to the left. Callista noticed. No one else did. In the margin where a sea had lapped a country it was not yet allowed to touch, a small star winked in the brass ring like a man who knows a joke he cannot tell. It refused once, the notebook had said. The lectern remembered. We created the witness without ceremony, and yet with all ceremony. Odo sealed a panel. I pressed wax. Father Valerian impressed the seal with a ring that had never belonged to him and therefore glowed with borrowed authority. The crate masqueraded as furniture. The corridor agreed to forget it was a corridor and behaved like a hallway moving chairs. When the last nail bit home, Father Valerian exhaled a prayer that contained no pronouns. He placed his palm on the lid and closed his eyes. If he said anything, it was not for us. Then he opened them and looked at me again, and this time the question on his face was replaced by an instruction that had nothing to do with keys or chains or stairs. Rest, he said, and when you wake, copy the decree. I nodded. The obedience was easy. The mercy in it was not. In my cell, I washed my hands in a basin that had never seen silver. The water was ordinary and grateful. I held my right hand under the lamplight. No mark. I held my left, the finger that had brushed the well. No mark. I closed both into fists and felt a difference in temperature where the drop had burned like ice. I slept without deciding to. The mind, exhausted by the work of holding sanctioned untruths at arm's length, sometimes falls into sleep the way a soldier falls into a trench, by accident, exactly where he was ordered to stand. In the dream, I stood in a library without locks. Books moved themselves closer to be read by the hands that wanted them. None were chained. No margins had been salted with crawling ink. A woman with a halo that refused to sit still laughed in the next aisle, as if a joke had finally reached her century. The atlas lay open and was not chained. North pointed wherever the reader had been born. Time did not behave better. It behaved honestly. The well rang like cut crystal tapped lightly by a spoon, and the sound did not stop. It lengthened into a thread that ran through every page in the room. When I woke, my pillow was damp from breath. I had been too asleep to ration. By morning, the city had accepted its realignments with the docility of a clock that's been told to smile. The Jesuits sent a note, the length of a blink. Concordance achieved. The Rosicrucians sent a bottle with no label. The cork smelled like thunder. Callista left. On my desk, a thimble. Inside it, 1 grain of silver. I did not ask whether it was the last. There is always one more grain if you are willing to call dust by a different name. Father Valerian summoned me to the confessor's desk with a slip of paper that contained only the hour. He waited with the silver-chained book, forgotten on purpose, on the shelf behind him. "You did well," he said. He does not congratulate, he inventories. "You did well" can mean the well did not refuse. It can mean you held your face steady while the city pretended to get cleaner. It can mean, "I saw the drop choose you, and will not say so until you think you have gotten away with it." I accepted the sentence, as a man accepts a glass of water. With gratitude he refuses to inventory. He slid the decree toward me. "The clean copy," he said, "for signatures that need to believe they thought of this first." I took up the pen. The line spacing was tight as a conscience. I wrote the formal language that turns harm into hygiene. I wrote the dates the bridge had taught us to prefer. I left room for the ring to kiss the wax. I inscribed, at the very bottom, the clerk's flourish. I had practiced as a novice. A line that loops back under itself, elegant and empty. The calligraphic equivalent of saying, "Amen," with a mouth that believes in sleep. Before I could sand the page, he touched my wrist with the gentlest pressure a human can use and still be believed. "Tell me," he said, "what did the water say to you?" I do not know whether he meant the word or the knowledge. I do not know whether he believed the well speaks. I do not know whether he was offering me the protection that comes from telling a dangerous truth to a man who knows how to file it gently. I met his eyes and saw not appetite but fatigue. "Inventory," I said, and surprised myself. He nodded, as if relieved that the word was dull. "Then you understand," he said. "We count so that others can forget." "Do they?" I asked. "Not reliably," he said, and smiled, "but reliably enough." We sat, the decree drying between us, the ring cooling beside its heat. Outside, bells made the noon unarguable. Inside, a well I could not see tuned the day's memory to a key men in my position will spend the rest of their lives pretending is native. When I left his desk, I placed my palm on the seam, as I always do. The stars in the cross did not move. But the stone was warmer than it had any right to be. Perhaps warmth is the courtesy secrets grant to those who have agreed to carry them longer than is healthy. That evening, as I made my rounds, I set the chained atlas to the plate that maps the routes beneath the transept. The brass ring slid a breath. In the ring's tiny edge, a reflection, not my face. Never mine, but a circle of water, and in its black, a word forming briefly and then vanishing like fog disturbed by a hand. Return. I have told you the right. I have not told you the voice I heard later that night, lodged in the hinge where sleep meets obedience. It said, as if reporting the weather, "The most dangerous thing to them is memory coming back." The sentence did not threaten. It did not even accuse. It recommended. In the morning, the ledger waited, patient as an emptied plate. I wrote the hour, the deed, the witnesses' hours, not the one we lowered. I put the book away. I looked at my hand. I closed it. In the dark of the annex, the well held its note, and the city tuned itself to it as merciful men tune to the key that flatters them. If you listen from the nave, you will hear bells. If you listen from the stair, you will hear breathing. If you listen from the rim, you will hear a history, happy to be edited. But if you place your hand where the drop burned me and wait very still, You will hear the questions gathering like rain in a summer tunnel. They do not belong to me. They are mine to carry. We have one chapter left. It will not be the cleanest. It may be the truest. Mourning in the quiet wing is an act of polite denial. The corridors rehearse their light. Keys yawn in their bowls. The ledger waits at attention like a soldier who dreamed of farming and woke with a rifle strapped to his conscience. The night after the washing, the city accepted its corrected hours and left thank-you notes in the mouths of bells. On paper, concordance was achieved. In bone, something else had begun. I kept working. Men like me keep working because the day is deft at making obedience look like oxygen. I took inventory of reliquaries that behaved, and of reliquaries that made a point of needing to face east. I answered a pilgrim's question with the deftness of a man who has practiced speaking as if the truth were shy and gratitude were louder. I mended a page with silk thread thin enough to pass through a will and leave no visible clause. I polished a seal until it reflected only what it was told to see, and then I went without writing it down to the annex. The seam door did not greet me. It practiced the kind of indifference a gentleman learns at court. Cross, 7 stars, the almost human patience of stone. The stare reintroduced me to my breath. In the small room, the well waited, black and unpersuadable. A man can be forgiven for imagining a sentience in a circle of water that rearranges history when asked politely, forgiven, and then corrected. The well does not care. It remembers. I placed the ledger on the shelf and did not open it. I set the lantern in its niche and turned the wick so the flame stopped flattering my intentions. I stood at the rim. The burn in my hand had cooled into a fact without temperature. I did not touch the water. I did not speak. The room spoke to me, not in words. In the way stacked silence accumulates a grammar. In the way you can tell whether a room is used for mercy or for argument by the angle of the dust. The inscriptions across the floor flexed like a chest under a steady breath. In the metal lip, there is a tiny seam where 2 plates once learned to trust a solderer more than themselves. I pressed my fingertip there and felt not heat, not cold. The kind of neutrality a judge cultivates when choosing to be kind is the same as choosing to be remembered. I do not know how long I stood. Long enough for the ledger's absence to seem like a virtue, long enough for the word return to stop behaving like poetry and start behaving like arithmetic, long enough for the beaded drop in my dream to decide whether to become an argument or an instruction. When I finally lifted my hand, the well hummed at a pitch that found bone and said, "You will not leave me here alone." The next days rewrote themselves without the decency of warning. Odo submitted his report. Rose-silver sentences congratulating the equinox for learning manners. Callista turned in a bundle of linen for burning that smelled like a new blade and an old apology. Father Valerian drafted a letter whose clean copy made it look as if a bishop had been helpful. The atlas behaved itself in public and moved a page a breath in private. I wrote in the ledger with a steadiness I had never earned. And the questions came. They did not parade. They collected like condensation on glass, like breath on a winter pane that knows a face is coming. I woke to them and slept to them and carried them like coins I had sworn not to spend. Who replaced me? Why did you move the feast as if grief were a table? Who taught the star to behave like a margin? What summer did you call winter so a prophecy could be punctual? If a saint can be corrected, who owns forgiveness? I answered none of them aloud. I wrote their shapes into the way I walked. A week later, though the calendar we had helped write insisted it was 2 days. The sculptor's crate was uncrated in a room with better windows. The figure lay there, not so much sleeping as practicing restraint. The circlet had left its faint ring. The sockets stared their emptiness into the brick. Callista adjusted a strap that would not be used again and said, "We did not lower it all the way." It sounded like both a confession and a gratitude. Odo wrote notes on a slip of paper with numbers that looked like hours, unwilling to be baptized. Father Valerian laid his palm on the brow and then, almost tenderly, on the ring the circlet had made. He whispered, maybe to himself, "Not every baptism is for a soul." That night he summoned me to the confessor's desk. The book with the silver chain waited on the shelf behind him, nameless and heavy with its own patience. He looked older, the way men look older when they have stored away the truth too neatly. "You must sleep," he said, which is the pastoral equivalent of a warning. I nodded. He did not release me. "Tell me what you will do with the questions," he added. The lamp threw a net of light across the desk, "and let my hands be caught in it." "I will carry them," I said, and it sounded in that room like a promise to commit a minor crime. He turned the ring on his finger, not his, never his, and regarded the stone in it as if it might remember him and relieve him of a burden. "Some men drown," he said. "Some men teach drowning to forget how to be fatal." He paused. "Some men learn to breathe under the kind of water we keep." He did not specify which he thought I was. He slid a scrap of paper toward me. On it, 3 words. It refused once. The notebook's line in his hand. "Will it refuse again?" I asked. "Every story does," he said, "if it lives long enough. They have so long rhyme. They have Wadar." He dismissed me with a gentleness that made me want to confess the well, the bead, the word inventory, the face behind the vacancy whose mouth had let permission into my bones. I did not confess. I left and went to the seam and placed my palm there, as if thanking an animal that had permitted me a dangerous ride. "I had told you I would not preach. I am not preaching, but a confession that stays indoors becomes an indulgence. A confession that steps into the street becomes a map." So by increments that looked, to anyone watching, like dutiful errands, I went outside. Cities have official names, and the names they answer to when the doors are shut. There is the Rome tourists practice like an anthem, and the Rome that lifts its hem to wade across alleys when a storm insists. There is also the Rome below Rome, stitched together by water, that holds its breath while decisions pass overhead. I followed the dotted line I had seen on the pilgrim map, the insolent descent under streets that pretend their stones do not float. In shadow, measurements become favors. A corner that in daylight apologizes for being sharp becomes, at night, a hinge. A hinge becomes an entrance. I met a woman who sells candles under the eaves of a closed market. She looks like famine learned manners and then decided not to forgive. She sells beeswax in sticks that want to sing and tallow in sticks that prefer arguments. I bought both. "Blue flame for truth," she said, "either to me or to the air. Red for stories." She spat impeccably and then added, "They're the same once you go below." I met a boy whose job is to know which stair does not belong on any plan. He pointed me down with the generosity of the young who have not yet learned to mistrust gratitude. "There is a room," he said, "that listens." He had never been, He had never needed to be. Some inherit the surface and are not harmed by it. I met a mason, drunk enough to be tender, who told me the prayer he whispers before laying the last stone in a wall. I ask it to be honest, he said, and if it cannot be, I ask it to be kind to men who fall against it. He squinted at me, as if I were an angle he could finally measure. You look like a man who is about to leave a door ajar. I followed the map to a garden wall and counted bricks until I found one that had been removed more often than its neighbors. Beneath it, the tunnel yawned with the even breath of old work. I descended, and the city rearranged itself overhead into stories more honest than law. The air cooled the questions and made them less theatrical. The well's distant note, whether memory or imagination, I will not declare, threaded a path like a string through a labyrinth, sewn for someone else's thread. At the bottom of those stairs, I did something only a fool or a priest would do. I prayed, not for absolution, not for strength, for specificity. I asked to remember without worshiping accuracy. I asked to be kind without agreeing to be harmless. I asked to carry a matched pair of sentences without dropping either. Silence wasn't sacred. It was enforced. And do no harm to the living if you can keep from it. The two are not incompatible, but they require a man to accept that sometimes speaking is a surgery. I returned to the wing and worked, because that is what men do when they have been trusted with too much and permitted to confess too little. I copied decrees that kept wars from arguing with eclipses. I labeled objects that had never been where their labels insisted. I corrected a pilgrim story into something a bishop would accept and left intact, the part where her hands shook when she touched a bone that had learned to be patient. I brought Odo coffee strong enough to embarrass angels and let him talk about elegant compliance until his sentences tired and his compassion woke up. In the evenings, I wrote on scrap paper I did not store in any drawer with dignity. I wrote a ledger that white ledgers cannot read, the names of the vacated as I could find them, the dates they lost, the feasts that replaced them. I recorded not the official, but the original, a saint who loved kitchens more than councils, a scribe who corrected a miracle down to a mercy, a physician whose cure was recorded as a repentance because it was a woman's hands that set the bone. I did not write where I had seen what I had seen. I did not write who had moved which teeth in the clock. I wrote only the kind of truth that survives if the house burns, the kind that teaches a stranger how to get out. When I had filled the first scrap and the second, I did what a foolish man does with tender things. I hid them in the chained atlas, not cheekily, respectfully, between plates that no one consults without consent, beneath a brass ring whose geometry has learned to pretend it is ornamental. Callista watched and did not stop me. There are places, she said, thread in her mouth, that refuse to lie even when you bribe them with silver. She nodded and bit the thread and added, "Make sure you choose one." Weeks passed that were calendars in public and conscience in private. The Jesuits left a courtesy bottle with a note that smelled of chalk. The Rosicrucians sent a diagram that looked like weather deciding to forgive. Father Valerian wrote fewer clean copies and more loose lines. The sculptor visited his figure and laid a palm on its wing, as if measuring the temperature of something that had learned to imitate flesh. The boy under the market whistled a tune that descends stairs politely and does not stumble. And then a letter came that was not meant for me, but undeniably mine. A hand I had never met wrote, We remember the refusal. Tell us when to try again. No seal, no ring's kiss. Only a rust smell where a file had scratched the envelope's edge. Sister Callista folded it once, twice, and placed it in my palm like placing a promise into a hand that has broken promises before and learned to be careful with the next. Father Valerian summoned me. He does not slam, he convenes. The work, he said quietly, is going to shift its weight. Floors creak when that happens. You will hear men call the creaking a miracle or a warning. It is neither. It is wood being honest. He glanced toward the atlas and then, as if the idea had asked permission, back to me. If you have written anything that will save a stranger from drowning, store it someplace the water cannot envy. There are sentences you spend all your vows earning the right to hear. I said, "Yes, Father," and went to the atlas and slid the folios where the rings would hold them without chewing, where the oak would embrace them, as if they were just more of the world, not less. The chains sighed. It is a sound chains make when they agree to be guardians rather than gaolers. That night, the seam's stars behaved as if no human hand had ever traced them. The well waited below. I did not go. When a room has learned you, you must not visit it with impatience. I walked the surface instead, and listened to bells lie politely to men who needed to sleep. I listened to steps that did not know they were walking corridors. A city invents for itself when it cannot admit it is grieving. And then I went home to my cell and wrote the last paragraph of a confession that had insisted on being born as a ledger. This is the part where the narrator traditionally asks your forgiveness. I will not. I am not sorry I opened the door. I am not sorry I touched the water. I am not sorry the drop burned without leaving proof. I am not sorry I bathed a misalignment and learned that misalignment is often a synonym for someone else's memory. I am not sorry. The Atlas keeps secrets for us now. But I will ask you for something else. Do not let this be entertainment only. Document the margins before they are scraped. Photograph inscriptions as if they were faces. When a guide tells you that a map's dotted line is decorative, ask which room is so beautiful it must be hidden. When a calendar shifts, do not only ask how, ask who benefits. When a museum label says unknown master, hear in that modesty the theft of a woman's hands. When a relic moves to a new reliquary and is christened with a new blessing, light 2 candles, one for the official, one for the original. Let both burn without arguing about whose smoke is prettier. Learn the smell of old paper, not romanticized accurate. Iron gall and myrrh, and the faint animal tang of parchment that once knew a body, and the metallic breath of silver when it decides to be useful. Learn the patience of dust, how it demonstrates the root of a curious finger years later. Learn the humility of ink that admits it was wrong, and the arrogance of ink that demands we redraw the harbor to suit a ship's pride. Read the quiet wing in your own city, wherever you are. Every institution builds one. It may not have seams etched with stars. It will have a ledger. It will have a shelf where faces are softened to halo and then forgotten. It will have a cupboard of tools that have never seen their honest names. It will have a well not of water, perhaps, but of memory. A place where, if you lower the right witness, a story will agree to be edited for the comfort of men whose hands forget how to wash themselves without help. Here is your ritual. Keep a small notebook. Title it with a name you would be relieved to forget, and therefore never will. In it, Write the original dates when you can find them, the first names before they were polished, the places a story starts to bend. Tuck a page behind the atlas of your own life, the one you chain to make yourself manageable. Leave a dot between two letters where later clerks will correct it. Let the correction become a door. And when you hear a hum that finds your jaw, when a room seems to hold its breath exactly the length of time it takes to lower an argument into a pool, when a city behaves as if a feast has been moved, and no one remembers, why do not panic, do not preach, do not declare the world ending. Ask a question out loud in the smallest voice you own. Then wait. Silence, you will discover, is not sacred. It has simply been enforced. It will relax if treated with patience. The answer will not be neat. It will be a direction. Do not stop asking questions. This is not a slogan. It is a maintenance schedule for memory. Ask the kind of questions that are not designed to be outvoted. What changed? Who signed? What went missing that made the remaining parts look truer? Where did the chain attach? What is the seam pretending to be? Who is the saint whose halo survived her face? Which century has a tooth that doesn't fit the bite? Write the answers, because without written questions, memory behaves like a generous liar. If you need a benediction, take this one. The most dangerous thing to them is memory coming back. They know this. They try to bathe it. They strap it into cradles and lower it into wells that accept correction and return usefulness. It works until it doesn't. It works until a bead burns a clerk's hand and teaches him a word, as dull as inventory and as sharp as a blade hidden in a fold. Return. I will not tell you where the seam is. That is mercy. I will not tell you the room's exact smell. That is prudence. I will not name the face that winked through the vacancy. That is love. I will tell you this. Somewhere under every city that prides itself on order, a well rings without ripples. Somewhere, a ledger practices pretending that obedience is the same as innocence. Somewhere, an atlas waits, chained for now, listening for the weight of a hand that will lift a page and find, between two plates, a scrap of paper a man stored so a stranger would not drown. If that stranger is you, here is the torch. It is small. It will not make you safe. It will make you visible to the rooms that listen. Hold it close, then pass it on.